Since the early days in the music industry, people have been finding artists, bands, and musicians that they find they constantly want to tap their toes to, dance with, or sing along to. But the music from those days began to evolve as years went by. We saw the live albums like Wings Over America, the compilation album like Queen's Greatest Hits, and the concept album like the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But the album that stands out the most to me are these so-called self-titled albums. Hello, and welcome to the Self-Titled Podcast. My name is Aiden. Together, we will explore some of these albums, whether they be from big or small artists, and I'm here to tell you all about them and all the information you'll ever need. For our first ever podcast, we're starting with a major player, Sir Paul McCartney. McCartney has been involved in the music industry since his early years, playing in clubs throughout Hamburg and Liverpool. Of course, even the Beatles eventually made their own self-titled album that people casually call the White Album, but I don't plan on focusing on the Beatles yet. Today, we're staying focused on Paul McCartney, the solo artist. And I do really mean solo. His self-titled albums are entirely him. No other person plays or sings, besides his wife, on any instrument or any vocal track of these albums. He played wine glasses, guitars, piano, drums, and so much more, all by himself. In total, McCartney has released 3 of these self-titled albums, with each being made during a significant moment in his life. I'll dive more into what these are during each specific album. With that being said, let's hop onto the first album, of course, called McCartney. First up, McCartney 1. Released April 17, 1970, the former Beatle was the first of the group to release their solo work. He began recording in 1969, around the time the film and the accompanying album, Let It Be, was being recorded. McCartney needed to be able to get the stress of the studio sessions with his other bandmates off of his back. And of course, during that time, the Beatles were facing multiple crises, with one side being on the business side with Apple Records and their poor monetary choices, and the other relationship is with each other that was slowly falling apart. This meant when McCartney was back at his home, he would write and record all of his songs all by himself. And that was really the main draw of the album to me. The fact that McCartney was showing off all his talents as a musician. No collaborators and nothing else. It's pure McCartney, all by himself. He was singing, playing, and writing the lyrics all by himself within his own studio. There was only one song that was recorded in the usual Abbey Road studios, and that really became the standout of the album to me. It really feels much more of a complete song than the rest of the album. The single, Maybe I'm Amazed, was that track. And that was the one that critics and listeners found to be the best of the album. And critics didn't even really like the McCartney one. They found it to be not ambitious, not anything like the Beatles, and really just disappointing. So having one standout win was a big deal to McCartney. And because of the recording of this album, and it being a stress reliever and all that, it was done for McCartney's own enjoyment. It means that he goes on random bits for his music. It tackles his love for his wife with the lovely Linda, and his love for folk music with Teddy Boy, and really just whatever McCartney thought sounded good with the track Junk. Some people even consider this album to be one of the first indie or independent sounding albums, and kickstarting the genre. And honestly, I can see where they're coming from. I would agree with them. It really does have that lo-fi feeling that a lot of indie albums tend to come with. Even McCartney himself admitted to Rolling Stones magazine that it was, quote, it's now what would be called an indie thing. A little further down the road, McCartney started his own band, so his own solo projects began to fall to the wayside, and this was the time that Paul McCartney and Wings were becoming a worldwide sensation. However, as that band began to fall apart around the 1980s, Paul McCartney began to experiment with his own equipment. These experiments that he never thought would turn into an album later became known as McCartney 2. In the summer of 1979, McCartney began to play around in his home studio in Scotland. This time, McCartney, without even knowing it, was on his own again. His band, Wings, was releasing their final album, Back to the Egg, that same year, even if they didn't realize it was the last one. However, this time, McCartney was really experimenting with new technologies and wildly changing his music, even down to his vocals. Released on May 16, 1980, the album was shared to the world. However, while McCartney 1 was left with an underwhelming reaction, McCartney 2 confused people, with its wildly different approach to sounds and noises and just all around being way more experimental than people thought. During the last few touring sessions, McCartney was giving a sneak peek to that album, with the hit song that would be called Coming Up, but it didn't sound quite like the studio version. The song was really even so impactful that after a 5-year slump, John Lennon, a former Beatle and great friend of McCartney, went back into his producing of music and released Double Fantasy from it. McCartney 2, yet again, had every instrument played by Paul, but this time, with his new experiments, McCartney managed to make an album that wasn't quite rock, but it wasn't quite anything else at the time. He really jumped into this new thing that the 80s would be well known for, which was new wave and synth pop. The album had less standout sounds because just how different it was and how unique it was to his usual style, with songs such as Temporary Secretary and Check My Machine changing his voice, changing his style, and being repetitive. However, to me, I think these are fun songs, especially seeing McCartney just playing around with genres of his music, which he hasn't really done too much since what feels like Sgt. Pepper's and things like that. McCartney 2 really is a weird standout. McCartney even himself has said if he was going to do something like that, he would go and record it with his other sort of band, The Firemen, which has more experimental music. McCartney 2 really did just slip under everything, but it's come back to be known as a cult classic. People really love how McCartney 2 sounds, and honestly, I think I'm on that bandwagon. McCartney 2 really is such a unique sounding album that it feels fresh every time you listen to it. Released in 2020, the year the world went to basically a complete standstill, McCartney decided, with the time that he has, he's gonna play some unrecorded things that he hasn't touched or thought about in years. Created in Rockdown, a spin on the lockdowns the world was facing at the time, McCartney 3 is yet again McCartney going inside of his home studio and just playing around with the stuff he has. As with the other two self-titled albums, McCartney didn't plan on it to become an album. Instead, he was just playing around, doing whatever thought sounded good and keeping himself entertained during really not a great time in the world. And it just happened to be that someone told him he's got enough to create an album, and so he went with it. So while McCartney 3 is definitely a rock-focused album, it deals with feelings that people had at the time. The track Find My Way is one of the singles of the album that focuses on people with an anxiety and getting through the day, just bit by bit, especially impactful during the pandemic. And Women and Wives, another song, is like a life lesson in explaining to younger generations how to be good and grateful for what you have and the people in your life. The only song that wasn't recorded during the lockdown sessions is the last one off the album, When Winter Comes. The song was recorded during the album Calico Skies in the 1990s. However, to me, it really is the best song on the album. You can hear some of McCartney's older voice and some of his younger voice at the same time, but it's also just a happy domestic bliss song that McCartney is just such an expert at creating. This type of song really is impactful to the people who listen to it, and it really makes it for an interesting experience. McCartney really is a masterful in capturing these worlds into songs that you didn't realize you just wanted to be a part of. McCartney really captured the appeal of everyone around this time, securing his first number one in his home country of England since 1989's Flowers in the Dirt. McCartney also won a Grammy for the Best Rock Album and Best Rock Song of that time. And with the release and success of the album, McCartney has reached a legendary status of having an album released to commercial success in every single decade since he split on his own in the 70s. And if we're counting the Beatles, he's had successes and number ones from the 60s to the 2020s. McCartney 3 continued to capture people's attention when the following year he allowed newer and younger and more interesting artists, well, I wouldn't say more interesting, to cover all the songs he created with his own McCartney 3 Imagine. This was allowing these people to put spins onto his album, his classic songs, and yet again, it captured everyone's attention, and it became another huge hit and seller. As we just went through, McCartney has had a long existence enjoying his time with music. The McCartney albums are special to just about anybody who enjoys the Beatles and McCartney himself, just because they are entirely him. They're pure McCartney. McCartney has had a unique sound to him, and still being able to show up with new tunes and ideas at 80 years old, I mean, it's really just an inspiration to everybody. I hope you enjoyed this little history of McCartney's self-titled albums, and I hope you'll come back next time for another interesting deep dive into these self-titled albums and their place in an artist's career. Thank you. All information that I didn't know was found on Wikipedia, McCartney's own website, and Rolling Stone magazines. Thanks again.